stark terror is the keynote of this strange tale. The Hairy Monster, written by Neil Miller, told to you by Edward E. French. I'm not a scientific or learned man. If I were, perhaps I might be able to set down the events which I am about to chronicle in such a manner as would be of enormous value to the scientific world. Had the events which I am about to relate been witnessed by a man possessed of a knowledge of science, the world would undoubtedly have been made richer by the passing of Dr. Carroll. For then we would have a true explanation of all that took place within the mysterious laboratory which he had fitted up for himself. We would then have a solution of the most mystifying series of circumstances I have ever heard of. Alas, that I alone know all the absolute facts surrounding the affair, and I alone, of all the world, am perhaps the man least fitted for the task of setting them down. For as I have stated, I know nothing of science or of the principles involved in the doctor's experiments. The best I can do is to write down the actual occurrences in the best way I know, and permit my reader to draw his own conclusions. Were I a writer of fiction, the reading of what is to follow might have been made much more pleasurable. But then perhaps I might have yielded to the temptation which I found to be very common to writers, to polish up and gloss over certain occurrences which took place with the view of making them more thrilling and interesting. The events themselves are thrilling enough, and if you do not find them interesting, the fault lies only in my meager ability to relate what I know to be the absolute facts. Why Dr. Carroll, with his host of scientific friends, should ever have taken a fancy to me is more than I have ever been able to figure out. Certainly I am not one who would attract attention from such a learned man as he. In fact, I was but a servant of the doctor's, yet at times he treated me with more courtesy than he did his colleagues in science. I was his gardener, with a little cottage of my own at the edge of his estate. And very often in the evening the doctor would drop in for a quiet smoke and a few minutes' conversation. And on one or two occasions I have known of his actually deserting a learned company of savants to come to my cottage and converse with me. Naturally, I believe that Dr. Carroll thought a great deal of me, and I would have died for him. I think his eyes were the most noticeable thing about him. Strange, magnetic eyes they were, which, when one looked into them, seemed to possess the property of holding his gaze until the doctor chose to look away. Hypnotic, I guess you would call it. Certainly no man could ever forget the eyes of Dr. Carroll. And because I could never forget the eyes of my master, a group of analysts judged me insane. Bah! They do not know what I know, and probably never will. From time to time, the learned doctor had been engaged in scientific experiments. Though I never did know the complete details of those experiments, I did know that the doctor held an enviable place in the world of science, and that he was the author of several books which had caused sensational stirs among his fellow scientists. In fact, I was at all times impressed with the depth of the doctor's learning. And I never ceased to marvel at the things he sometimes showed me in his laboratory. Horrible, grotesque, and sometimes seemingly supernatural were the things which he brought before my attention. Had I been superstitious or of weak heart, I know that I would long ago have died of the horrors which he showed me. But the calm, precise doctor often complimented me by saying that I was able to see such things in the calm, dispassionate light with which all scientists must view their experiments. Thus encouraged, I continued my infrequent visits to the laboratory and endeavored to manifest an enthusiasm for the horrible and eerie things which he showed me, though often After seeing some of his terrible creations, I would return to my hut and lie awake all night long, too shaken by the sights I had witnessed to go to sleep. The result of the doctor's last experiment, however, made such a deep impression upon me that for 3 months after, I was confined to the violent ward of the state hospital, with the attendants despairing of ever restoring my sanity. It was in the latter part of May that I first began to miss the doctor from his accustomed haunts. No longer did he come down to my cottage in the evening for a quiet smoke and a few minutes' chat. From Mr. Barton, the doctor's son-in-law, I learned that he was spending most of his time in the concrete laboratory, appearing at the house only for his meals and to snatch a few hours' sleep. "It is something big he is working on this time," said Mr. Barton. "He won't let any of us go near the laboratory, not even Bessie. When he does appear at the house, it is only to snatch a bite to eat or to doze for a moment. Then he is all haste to get back to the laboratory, and he is so nervous and excited. I swear that I have never seen him so enthusiastic over an experiment. We'll see a lot of excitement around here when he finally throws open the door to the laboratory and invites his friends out to see what he has done." Remembering some of the things I had seen within the grim walls of the laboratory, I could not restrain a shudder. But as the days passed, I found that a certain morbid curiosity seemed to be continually drawing me toward the laboratory in the hope that I might gain an inkling as to what was going on behind those closely barred windows. That it was something to strike fear to the heart of mortal man, I well knew, yet I could not keep away from the place. Then the doctor disappeared entirely, and I learned that he was having his meals sent out to him, and was spending both days and nights within the walls of the laboratory. About a month after the doctor had shut himself up in the concrete laboratory, I had been working on the far side of the estate, and at sunset, as I turned my steps toward my cottage, I met Mr. Barton. He fell into step beside me and walked to my door. I knew at once that the young man was deeply worried about something, and though he spoke no word as we walked along, I knew that he wanted to confide in me. But I held my peace. At last we left the shadowy woods and came out upon the concrete driveway which led to the house and the laboratory. For a time we walked along, the only sound being the crunch of our feet on the gravel which a recent rain had washed down. I was vainly trying to arrive at some conclusion as to what had so disturbed my young companion, when suddenly I stopped and stared in horror at a spot on the pavement. There, gleaming in the setting sun, lay a large pool of fresh blood. Barton saw it about the same time I did, and I noticed that he shuddered. Then, as though desiring to lose sight of the crimson pool, he quickened his pace. "Blood!" he muttered as though to himself. "Fresh blood every day, always at the same time, and every day there's more of it." "What's that, sir?" I asked respectfully. He stopped suddenly and seized my sleeve. "Greening," he said nervously. This thing is getting on my nerves, and I've simply got to have someone to talk to. You saw that pool of blood back there, but do you know what it means?" I admitted that I did not. "I only wish that I did," he said. "I do know that day after day the doctor has been receiving ever-increasing quantities of blood. At first it was only a quart, then it was a gallon. Today," here he lowered his voice, "today it was 10 gallons. It probably has something to do with his experiments," I said, with attempted lightness. "I have known of him having stranger things than blood in that old laboratory." "What kind of an experiment can he be conducting which requires 10 gallons of blood every day?" demanded Mr. Barton. "I tell you, man, I'm afraid. I have a feeling that something is going to happen, something terrible." At last he left me, still muttering that something terrible was about to happen. For a long time after he had gone, I sat alone on the veranda of my cottage, watching the bright red glow of the western sky. red like blood. And then I shuddered. Why? I know not. I do not think that I had been influenced by Mr. Barton's fears. Indeed, I had almost forgotten them. But suddenly there had come over me an overwhelming premonition of impending disaster. Though the night was hot and sultry, I felt suddenly cold and afraid. Thinking to lose this feeling of depression, I rose and entered the house. Inside, with the light switched on, things began to assume a more cheerful aspect. Indeed, I managed to laugh at my fears, which seemed so groundless. Would to God that I had heeded them! At last the clock struck 12. I rose and began to prepare for bed. After extinguishing the light, I stepped out onto the veranda and looked up the driveway toward the laboratory. The night was hot and sultry, with promise of rain before the morrow. Light, scudding clouds raced across the sky, at times entirely obscuring the moon. I noticed that the doctor had thrown open one of the big steel shutters, probably to gain air. Satisfied that all was well, I re-entered my cottage and promptly went to bed. Sleep was a long time in coming, and when at last I drifted into a restless slumber, my sleep was disturbed by a terrible dream in which I seemed to be drowning in an ocean of blood. Above me, the strange, magnetic eyes of the doctor smiled cryptically and seemed to hold me with their hypnotic power above the eddying currents which endeavored to engulf me. I woke, gasping for breath and sweating from every pore in my body, and possessed of such a feeling of horror as I had never known before. For a time, I could not believe that the whole thing had been but a terrible dream. The billows of blood still seemed to surge about me, and there, directly above my bed, shone a pair of round, luminous eyes. How long I stared at them, too shaken to move, I do not know. It seemed an eternity that those two awful eyes glared unblinkingly into mine as I lay trembling and impotent. Then suddenly the thing dropped upon me. I was instantly smothered beneath the horrible clawing thing. The soft, yielding, hair-covered body seemed to weigh me down, while the unspeakable stench sickened and suffocated me. Great sinewy arms, at least a dozen in number, wrapped themselves about my body as though in an effort to crush me to death. I felt the hot, stagnant breath of the beast close to my face, and realized that the murderous jaws were ever drawing nearer to my throat. In vain did I rain blows upon the body of the creature, though at times my fists sank deeply into the flesh. They made no impression. At last, with the final remnant of my rapidly ebbing energy, I managed to roll over and throw the beast to the floor. There followed a sound of confused scuffling, and a moment later I caught sight of a large shadow at the window. The accursed thing had gone. For several minutes I lay on my back, striving to get back my breath and strength. Then I rose unsteadily to my feet, switched on the lights, and securing a shotgun which I always kept handy, I stepped outside with the view of pursuing this ungodly creature. I must have slept longer than I thought, for the sky was now completely overcast, and off in the west lightning flashed incessantly. The rumble of thunder and the freshening breeze gave promise of rain in a very short time. Though the obscuring moon had deprived me of a very powerful ally, I was determined to sleep no more that night until I had found the beast. Attracted by the dim light which still glowed in the laboratory, I made my way toward it and peered in through the open window. There, so close that I could have touched him had I cared to reach through the bars, sat the doctor. He had his back turned toward the window and was bending over his desk, writing. Apparently there was nothing wrong here, except that the doctor was slowly wearing himself out with his experiment. I tarried there in the light from the open window. Somehow, after my ordeal with that terrible thing, the proximity of another human seemed comforting. And as I stood there, watching the doctor ride away so quietly, I began to wonder if perhaps the whole thing had not been a terrible nightmare. Long I stood there, pondering on the question, and when I next looked at the doctor, his head had slumped down upon the desk, and the sound of his breathing told me that he slept. Meanwhile, the storm had rapidly been drawing nearer. Great ragged ropes of fire flashed across the leaden sky, and the thunder rumbled. Even as I stood, mentally debating if I hadn't better dismiss my nocturnal visitor as a product of my imagination and go back to bed, the storm broke in all its fury. I was about to make a dash for the shelter of my cottage, when suddenly above the tumult of the storm I heard a shrill, unearthly scream, as of a mortal thing in deadly terror. Instantly there surged into my mind a vision of that great, hairy, many-armed beast, and I raced away through the swirling rain toward the shadowy bulk of the house. Apparently others had heard the scream, for in the servants' quarters a light suddenly sprang into being. Other lights appeared, and I heard the sound of excited voices. Then again, that horrifying scream! Driven by a fear of I knew not what, I dashed through the house and up the broad stairway in front to the rooms occupied by the doctor's daughter and her husband. A small group of excited servants had gathered in a hysterical group before the door and were making a vain effort to force it in. Even as we struggled with the heavy oaken door, the scream was repeated, very feebly this time. Burroughs, the chauffeur, and I drew back and threw our combined weights against the door. And then as the massive panel crashed in, I saw a scene the like of which I never wish to see again. The room was literally drenched in blood. On the floor lay the lifeless and horribly mutilated body of Mr. Barton, while on the snowy expanse of the bed lay his wife. The throats of both had been terribly mangled, as though gnawed by some ferocious beast. Everywhere about the room the spatterings of blood gave mute, though tragic testimony of the mighty struggle which had taken place. Burroughs and I grimly drove the others away that they might not look upon the terrible sight. We dispatched the woman who had been the doctor's cook to the telephone with instructions to notify the police and summon a physician, though I knew he could do nothing. Then for a few moments Burroughs and I stood shuddering in the room of death. For my part, I was attempting to collect my wits and decide what to do. Of course, whoever committed this terrible crime came and went through the open window, I remarked absently, since the only door to the room was securely locked from the inside. It is quite apparent that the murderer must have entered through the window. But it is a sheer drop of 50 feet, remonstrated Burroughs with a shudder. I looked out the open window and saw that he was right, nor was there any visible means by which a person might raise himself up the smooth brick surface of the house. I tell you, no man did this, muttered Burroughs between his chattering teeth. It is the work of some damned beast. I read a story once by a guy named Poe, and that story told about two women who were murdered by an ape. And suddenly I remembered that terrible nightmare in my cottage. Could Burroughs be right? Could it have been a gigantic ape which had attacked me and murdered this couple? I shuddered at the thought, yet there instantly surged into my mind a thought even more terrifying, for now I knew that I had not dreamed about the creature. There, before me, lay the mute tragic testimony that the beast actually existed. But the many arms! Surely no ape ever possessed such a number. But if not an ape, then what was it?